So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Ecological Continuity Trust webinar. My name is Keith Golding. I'm Deputy Chair of ECT, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Langley-Randall, who's our speaker today. John joined ADAS 2 years ago, following his PhD in Environmental Science at Bangor University, where he studied the impact of slurry acidification an ammonia abatement technique on soil and crop health. Prior to completing his PhD, John worked in the conservation sector for a number of years after completing his MSc in Conservation and Land Management, also at Bangor. And since joining ADAS, John has worked on projects including Super G, a multi-year EU-wide project assessing the ecosystem service provision from sustainable permanent grasslands, on biosolids to land, assessing the potential for soil carbon storage following the recycling of biosolids to agricultural land, as well as the Natural England funded mob grazing project, which he's going to talk about today. And he's also working on a newer Defra-funded project, but not too much to say about that yet, because it's only part way through. Now, can I ask you please to turn your microphones and cameras off to save bandwidth? If you have questions, which we hope you do, please use the chat function at the bottom right. And Ben Sykes, who's our Executive Director, he and I will be watching the chat and asking the questions at the end. That's so that John doesn't have to be distracted by watching chat while he's giving his presentation. If it's appropriate, we'll ask you to unmute and open your camera and maybe join the discussion to get some lively discussion going, but we'll see what the questions are. And it's possible that John will ask his ADAS colleagues to help with the questions and answers too, because some of those have joined. For any of you hard of hearing, you'll see a white box in the picture in front of you, which tells you how to use closed captioning in WebEx. On the computer, there's a tiny little balloon in the bottom left of the screen with CC inside it. And if you switch that on, that will give you captions and highlights. And there's also a way to use it on your mobile device too. So please use that if it's of help. But now, John, it's over to you. We're delighted that you've been able to join us today. We're looking forward to what you have to say. Ben Sykes will now give you control of the screen and you can start your presentation. So John, over to you.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Keith. Perfect. Okay, so yes, so today I'm going to talk about the impacts of mob grazing on soil health, which was a Natural England funded project which we carried out winter and spring this year. And yeah, it's really to understand the growing interest in mob grazing practices in the UK and how that could impact on soil health. I'm just going to get my laser pointer on as well. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of this, but I think it's a useful place to start. I'm just going to run through a bit of an overview of the current grazing practices that are found typically in the UK. So a lot of the grasslands in the UK, these are typically set stocked or continuously grazed or rotationally grazed. And for the remainder of this, this webinar today, these will be known as conventional grazing. This will form the comparison with the mob grazing fields that we will come to look at. So typically, these set stocked conventionally grazed land is composed of low sward diversity, and that's dominated by perennial ryegrass. And due to the long-term nature of the grazing, it can result in the livestock grazing on preferred areas, and these areas can see an increase in weed species as a result of overgrazing, and as a consequence, the ecological function and the soil resilience of these conventionally grazed fields often declines. So, as an alternative, I'll now define what mob grazing is, and ultimately, it's quite difficult to define what mob grazing is, and this is all due to its dynamic nature, but it is largely a form of rotational grazing. And a couple of key aspects of mob grazing is the fact that within the rotational grazing aspect, it has a higher stocking density and grazing pressure. The areas of the field are generally grazed for shorter periods of time, and there seems to be longer rest periods between grazing intervals. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how the mob grazing systems used in the UK, Wagner et al. Has defined it as has acknowledged the fact that 84% of mob grazers were found to move cattle between 1 to 3 times a day, and you can really appreciate the high stock density in a mob grazing system in the US, where it can be up to just under 2,000 livestock units per hectare, and 40% of mob grazers were using a livestock density of over 400 livestock units per hectare. And this is often a result of fields being subdivided into individual cells to really increase that pressure on that parcel of land. So mob grazing is has a lot of perceived benefits that have been talked about as a result of the changes in grazing methods. So there's an idea that productivity increases. I'm saying these are perceived because there's actually very little data to back this up. But farmers that do use mob grazing systems use it because there's a perceived greater pasture productivity. And the reasons it's given is that it shifts the sward composition towards taller grass species, and also that when the sward is grazed at taller length, the grasses maximize their photosynthesis potential, and this is what increases their productivity. There's a reduction of weed species, and that's largely because of the greater stock density over a shorter period of time reduces preferential grazing. Also, there's a perceived benefit that the anthelmintic plants can become established. That's like the sandthorn, chicory, and bird's-foot trefoil, which can help improve soil health, livestock health. We've got potential reduced parasite burden, and this is due to the livestock being moved more frequently in the system, longer rest periods, and this disrupts the parasite life cycle. And there's also a perceived improvement of soil health and carbon sequestration. So as a result of the increased plant biomass that are returned to the soil following trampling and a more even distribution of feces and urine in each cell, there's a potential that we could see an increase in soil nutrients and soil carbon. And also the longer rest period between grazing events can increase and promote the soil growth. Also, there's a lot of discussion within the mob grazing community, which I found out during the interviews, which I'll speak through in a short while, that a main aspect of the actual idea of mob grazing is the fact that the animals graze a cell or a section of a field, and the herd eats 1/3 of the grass that's present. It also tramples 1/3, and then you leave 1/3 of the sward as it is before you move the animals on. And the trampling is a key aspect of the grazing, as it increases the plant returns to the soil, and this is an aspect of the system that potentially increases the soil organic carbon as well as potentially increasing nutrients. So that's a bit of an understanding of where we are in the UK in terms of conventional grazing, and then the perceived benefits of mob grazing and why it can be attractive to some farmers. So this study came about largely just to quite simply assess the impact of mob grazing on soil health, and this was using a paired farm approach, and it compared conventional grazing to some mob grazing fields, which I'll speak about in a second, and it's largely to fill some of the knowledge gaps from the perceived benefits to soil health and try and put some figures in those knowledge gaps. So to run through the methodology that we used in this study, so it was agreed with Natural England that to start off, we'll set up an online expression of interest form, which was circulated to Natural England and ADAS existing networks, but also using social media to engage new farmers to the system. And this was really, this expression of interest was to understand and try and capture farmers that were mob grazing. And the questions involved in this section was just to briefly outline the type of grazing management that they have and the grassland that they have on the farm, and pretty much just the age of the sward and the soil type. It was quite straightforward. That then allowed us to screen this data and then identify farms that we could potentially soil sample and put forward to being included in the study. So you had a good return of farms, a lot of interest in this study, but we only needed 24 PERs to be included as suitable to go forward for soil sampling and to be included in the study. So once we identified these farms, so it was largely based on length of time in mob grazing. So ideally we would want farms that had that mob grazed for the longest amount of time, so we could see that development over time. So once these farms were identified, a PER was established. So this was to ideally on the same farm, and it was important this part to stress that we were using either neighbouring fields if it was on the same farm that had both conventional and mob grazing, or we were asking a mob grazing farmer to nominate a neighbouring farm that had what we classed as conventional farming, and if that was okayed with the neighbouring farmer, we'll make sure that the field that was included in the study was one ideally as close to the mob grazed field that we had from the mob grazed farmer. And largely these fields were literally over a fence line, over a hedge line, and it was a really good way of engaging the different types of farmers in this activity. So once the PERs were identified, we then went through a more detailed questionnaire, and this really honed in on the management of the farm, so we could use this as part of the analysis later on in the study. So the typical questions that we asked here was to understand the length of time in grass, the fertilizer and manure use, and then look more into the grazing management. So try to understand the livestock type, the duration of grazing, and the numbers of livestock that were there. And that meant that we could use this in analysis that we'll talk about later on to talk about to understand and compare livestock units per hectare. So this is everything that was done before the site visits. And then during the site visits, we had quite an extensive soil sampling regime that was carried out throughout the field. So for the topsoil, we decided to sample at 0 to 15 centimetres, and this was kept as 3 discrete soil samples that were sampled for soil bulk density and the soil chemistry. And the soil chemistry was largely pH, the extractable nutrients, total N, and soil organic carbon. We also measured Solvita soil respiration and then soil particle size distribution. And then for the subsoil, this was bulked into one sample for each field. So again, this was largely just to look at the soil organic carbon, as we identified that as something of interest for the idea of mob grazing. We also carried out, using our field teams, as you can see on that picture on the right, a visual evaluation of soil structure. So this was taken in 2 depths. So that was 0 to 20 centimeters, given the depth of the spade, and then a further 10 centimeters down to 30, so the 20 to 30 centimeters. And that was carried out 3 times across the field using a standard W walk within the field at the sampling points. And then we also used earthworm count, which I'll speak a bit more in detail on the next slide, but that was carried out in the top 20 centimeters of the VES block. So yeah, the earthworms were identified down to ecotypes, and we decided to use ecotypes rather than species level just because of the speed that it can be done in field, and it gives an indication of the broad behaviours and the broad the broad ecosystems that each worm uses and utilizes in the soil structure, and that means that we could identify any potential impacts or benefits of the mob grazing system within the soil. So the ecotypes that we used in this study were anisic, which are worms that feed on soil and leaves, and these are the deep boring ones, so they bring vegetation down and organic matter from the soil surface down into burrows, and increase the soil organic matter potentially in the soil structure. Then we've got the endogeic, and that lives in the upper layers of the soil, and again feeds on the soil, but yeah, is really restricted to that top layer of soil. And then we've got the epigeic, which feeds on the decaying plant matter found on the surface. We also included the measurement and the count of juveniles, and these were separate from the adult worms because they're difficult to separate into ecotype because identification features haven't been developed yet on the worm. So moving on to the results that we found. So just to give a bit of an overview of the farms that we included in the study, these were the ones that we took forward to soil sampling. You can see there's quite a good distribution across the typical grassland areas within England. We offered it to farms in Wales as well, but unfortunately they didn't meet the criteria due to the length of time that they were mob grazing for. So the types of grazing that we had, it was dominated by suckler beef, and then in the conventional, we found that we had slightly more sheep conventionally grazing than we did mob grazing, and this is due to the fact that it was important to, when we were selecting herd farms, that we could get those farmers as close as possible. So the climate factors and soil texture changes that you could potentially find across a wider landscape weren't found, which is why that was a priority over the comparison of livestock. But generally, we had a good match of dairy, so that was 3 in both systems, and we had beef. There was 4 rearing and finishing beef in mob grazing and 2 in conventional. So that was the switch between the sheep and the beef, as we can see from the cells above. Interestingly, when I carried out the interviews, there was a big difference in the amount of newcomers to mob grazing, which you can see highlighted in the table below. We had 16 of the farms that were new to mob grazing, whereas the conventional farmers were dominated by farms that had been in that system for 10 years and above. And when I was carrying out the interviews, when I would come to the question of how long had they been in the system, a lot of the farms were, the conventional farmers would respond by saying forever. So it's a real long-term management style that some farmers have been implementing when it comes to conventional grazing. Whereas given the nature of mob grazing and the relatively new aspect to it being introduced in UK landscape into UK farming, it wasn't a real surprise that there were so few above certainly 10 years and potentially above 5 years. There we go. So again, this was some results from the farming interviews that we carried out, and this was the data that I took from the livestock types, and it converted it into livestock density. And just to reiterate that the top line here, these are the mob grazing results on this section, and we've got the conventional grazing fields below. And again, just to bring it to your attention, that the livestock density figures for conventional farming were an order of magnitude below the stocking density for the mob grazing, as you can see up here. Interestingly, when we carried out the the interviews, there was quite a distinct grouping of livestock density in the mob grazing systems between livestock types. So we can see down here this this bottom ring that I'm just showing with the highlighted laser pen here. That's dominated by sheep farmers, and they had the lowest. They had the typical lowest stocking density below the median value for mob grazers, whereas dairy farms were found to have the greatest, and we had some really high stocking densities, and these were above that 400 figure that 40% of the farmers in the US were grazing at, just to give some kind of comparison, but that was only a handful of farms at that kind of stocking density. But given the nature of the fact that we know that mob grazers typically graze for a shorter period of time, I thought it was quite important then to try and normalize this data by calculating this livestock stocking intensity. So to do this, I multiplied the livestock density by the number of grazing days, and that shows that the fields actually had a similar kind of level of grazing across the year, given the intensity by the grazing days. And we can see both the mob grazing here and the conventional grazing were below 500 livestock units per hectare over the grazing days that we grazed at, and that's very comparative between the two grazing types. And we also didn't find much of a difference there between the different types of livestock that were included in the study. However, typically the rest periods were a lot shorter in the mob grazing for sheep farmers. Again, this was at lower levels of what we found in the system of mob grazing, and there wasn't that differentiation really between dairy, suckler beef or beef finishes. They were all generally towards the higher end of the typical rest periods. But there was no differentiation between livestock density or rest periods in the conventional grazing. Another important aspect of mob grazing that was teased out in the interviews was the fact that mob grazers typically set higher pre and post grazing covers, and these could be in a variety of different ways. So some farmers were saying, would want it rally length, we want the grass rally length. Others would say we had a target dry matter per hectare cover density to turn the cattle out with. So it was some, again, would just do it by eye, whereas conventional grazers typically were found to turn the cattle out at a set date, or bring them in once they thought that they'd grazed as much as they could in that field. Something that I mentioned, I should have mentioned earlier, was the fact that we were able to identify some farms that had both conventional and mob grazing on the farm, and that was largely a result of some farm fields not being suitable for mob grazing practices, and this is largely due to infrastructure changes that might be needed on a field. So it might be due to water provision, because as fields are broken down into cells to encourage mob grazing, to include a cell structure within the mob grazed management, you then need to be able to provide water into each of these cells. And the other aspect is potentially size of the field or shape of the field. If it was a difficult shape to split up, or quite a small field that the farmer didn't really think it was worthwhile to include in the mob grazing system, this was something that we found. So largely, a lot of the farms that we included in the study, I think it was about 18 out of the 24, had both conventional and mob grazing management styles on their farm. So to get into the results of the soil chemistry, this is the difference between the pairs. So it's the mob grazing minus the conventional, just as a bit of a difference that you can gauge. So you can see there's actually very little difference between pH change. Arguably, soil organic carbon decrease, which I'll speak about in bit more detail on the next slide. And the total nitrogen, there was no difference there. There's a slight difference in the available potassium, and this is largely a reflection of potential changes in clay content. And other nutrients such as phosphorus and magnesium, again, there was no difference between mob grazing and conventional grazing. So to drill into this soil carbon changes a little bit more, these are the soil carbon stocks that we calculated based on the bulk density and the carbon levels that were found following analysis. And we found that all those changes were in the top 15 centimeters of the soil, and these were significant, statistically significant, where conventional farming was found to have larger carbon stocks than mob grazing. And although numerically this was reflected at all depths, there was no more significant differences. So for the total 30 centimeter profile and the 15 to 30 centimeter core that was taken. But there was a significant interaction with grazing management and the number of years in the grazing system. So this is likely to be a reflection of the fact that the soil carbon has built up for significant length of time for those farms that, as I mentioned earlier, had been grazing as conventional grazing, as what they classed as forever or over 10 years, whereas a lot of the mob grazers might have altered the management within 5 years, potentially introducing LTEs into the system, and then potentially reducing the carbon stocks that way. And then, interestingly, the soil biology was found to we found greater earthworm numbers in mob grazing sites, and this was largely dominated by the juveniles and the endogeic worm species compared to the conventional. And although these were significantly different, the juveniles and the endogeic worm numbers were significantly different as numbers when it was converted to biomass, so the weight of worms. These weren't found to be significant, but overall, when you totaled earthworm biomass within mob grazing and conventional plots, it was found to be significantly different, comparing the mob grazed and conventional grazed systems. So just to show that in a bit more detail, we can see here what's really driving those changes in the soil earthworm numbers. And yeah, you can clearly see here it's the juvenile and the endogeic, and then overall that gave a significantly greater total number of earthworms per meter squared compared to the earthworm biomass on the right hand side of the slide, which was only significantly different as an overall total. And just as a final for this experiment, the Solvita soil respiration showed no difference in microbial respiration between the two management types. So just to move on and introduce this longer Defra-funded mob grazing impacts, benefits and trade-offs project that we're working on with others, as you can see in the top banner there. So this is a multi-year project. As you can see, it's broken down here, and this is really trying to get a real detailed insight over multiple years into the aspects of mob grazing. So the aims of this study was to assess the practical, economic and environmental implications of mob grazing systems, and that was broken down into 4 different work packages, where it was to survey grazing practices with farmers and to provide a rapid evidence assessment of the literature that's already out there regarding mob grazing, and then really to go through some field experimental work, which is what we're partway through at the moment, and then at the end of it to deliver a best practice guidance. And you can see we've got sites all over the UK and all over England and Wales, and within this experiment we'll be measuring grass growth and forage quality, soil quality, environmental emissions, biodiversity, and we're also looking at the livestock performance as well. So for the rapid evidence assessment, the primary research questions were: what are the environmental impacts of rotational grazing? What are the productivity and profitability impacts of rotational mob grazing? and what are the impacts of rotational mob grazing for animal health and welfare, with the secondary research questions including, is mob grazing suited for particular species mixes, and does mob grazing impact on animal grazing behaviour? So the key findings for this were that there's actually limited evidence of the impact of mob grazing for each of the research questions, and very little research on mob grazing in temperate grassland regions, which is reflecting the fact that quite a lot of the mob grazing literature is carried out in areas such as the USA, where grasslands are potentially a bit more degraded. And there's a real challenge in defining the grazing system, which is what I found during the Natural England project, but was also picked up in the literature. And there's currently insufficient independent scientific research to provide a robust evidence base to assess the impact of mob grazing systems on ecosystem service delivery, grassland productivity, or animal performance and health, and especially in these temperate climatic conditions. So the field experiment was set up to go some of the way to explore these conclusions. And these experiments were carried out on and are being carried out on commercial farm sites. And each site will compare two grazing systems. There'll be a conventional set stock semi-rotational system compared to a more intensive mob grazing system. And this is carried out on a split field design where the fields are split between a control, which is the conventional, and the mob grazing system. And the livestock is allocated at the start of each season. Just to give you a bit of an insight, I know we might be a bit pushed on time, so I'll run over this quite quickly, but there's different soil types and livestock types that are being included in the study, and we've also tried to include a variety of UK climatic climatic areas as well. And the initial findings from this study was the fact that grass growth and forage quality for mob grazing treatments, they have longer pre and post graze covers, which was also found in the interviews that I carried out as part of the Natural England project. And the longer grass cover is linked with higher acid detergent fibre content, so an increase potentially in cellulose and lignin content of the grasses fodder, which would potentially reduce digestibility, and also lower metabolizable energy and crude protein content. And in terms of livestock performance, there was a lower live weight gain per head in mob grazing than the control of some farms. But overall, due to the higher stocking density per hectare, that live weight gain per hectare was higher due to this increased stocking density. We haven't got the soil quality and sward diversity data at the moment because the assessments are being carried out at the beginning and the end of each project. So just to give a bit of an overall conclusion based on both of these projects that we've got running at the moment, it's a real difficult aspect of mob grazing to actually define what mob grazing is. We found that farmers often use the term mob grazing interchangeably with other terms such as cell grazing and holistic grazing, but largely they're all rooted around the basic principles of moving livestock around a series of cells in quite quick rotation and using quite high livestock density. And that's reiterated on that second point where it says the key aspect of mob grazing is the fact that there's longer pre and post grazing covers and livestock are being grazed in smaller areas with a greater density. And overall, if we're talking about results from soil analysis, we found that there was a significant difference in earthworm numbers and biomass in mob grazed livestock, which could indicate a gradual build-up of potential soil organic matter being introduced into the system. But there's no difference in soil chemistry and soil physical properties. So throughout, so again, when we looked at the VES, which was data I didn't show, which was looking at the evaluation of soil structure, there was no difference in layers between any indication of compaction in the layers between the two systems. And like I showed on the screen, there was a greater concentration of soil organic carbon in conventional topsoil when it was calculated as carbon stocks. But as I mentioned earlier, the majority of the mob grazing farmers in this study had been mob grazing for less than 5 years, which could be a reason why that was found. But also, any changes in soil chemistry is likely to take quite a few number of years that potentially we didn't encompass in the study, given the fact that so many farmers were relatively new to the mob grazing system. So it might be worthwhile in a number of years' time to repeat the sampling just to see if there are any longer term changes that could be detected. So that's a brief summary of the project that we carried out. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat below.